All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the program. My name is Billy Dees. I'm here today for the fine folks over at humoroutcast.com. If you haven't had a chance yet, do check out that website. There's some great content over there, new postings pretty much every day. There's political stuff, societal stuff, all kinds of funny stuff. Humoroutcast.com. That is the place to take a humor break. And as part of their umbrella, they have a publishing house, HOPress, Shorehouse Books. Those are publishers run by the fine Donna Cavanaugh. We want to give a shout out to her. With me is one of their authors. On the line with me today is Dan Rottenberg. Dan, welcome to the program. So glad you are here.
Happy to be here, Billy.
Awesome. Dan is, we talk about books and, the self-help books and all these things come a dime a dozen, but this is a unique subject. This is one I have not heard too much about. The title of his book is The Price We Paid, an oral history of Penn's struggle to join the Ivy League. And this is 1950 to 1955. Now, this may sound like a real niche type of book, but I got to tell you, it's a little broader than that, because when you really start to get into the details of this is a story about the history of college in America, the relationship, better or for worse, between athletics and school. And this also has to do with sacrifice. A lot of times people who get themselves in a transitional period don't always get the benefits of the transition. And this has to do with personal sacrifice as well. So let me just kind of go through the blurb about the book just to give you an idea what it's about. Midway through the 20th century, the University of Pennsylvania stunned the sports world by scrapping its famous big-time football program in exchange for the academic prestige of membership in the newly created Ivy League. This astonishing choice ultimately helped catapult Penn into the ranks of the world's great universities. But in the short run, it brought pain and confusion to countless Penn players, coaches, administrators, and fans who were caught in the years of this transition. Their personal stories of that tumultuous period are told here for the first time. So this is a little snippet of history. I find it very interesting. Dan, let's talk about you a little bit.
Well, this book was really a labor of love. I am an alumnus of the University of Pennsylvania.
All right.
I also played football there in the early 60s, believe it or not.
Yeah.
People don't realize now that before 1950, Penn was the equivalent of Notre Dame or Ohio State, one of the great football powers of the nation, led the nation in attendance year after year, and then gave it all up to join the Ivy League in the early 1950s. And that story has really never been told. I've been to reunions of the men who played football for Penn in those years, and they always said to me, I am a former sports writer and I'm author of 12 books before this one. There's a story here that ought to be told. Why don't you do it? I finally got around about 5 years ago, started interviewing these surviving players and administrators and coaches who by this time were about, in their 80s or 90s.
Oh, sure.
And I should have done this years ago, but still, as they say, better late than never.
Yeah.
To hear what these guys had to go through, a lot of them who were recruited to play big-time football, then they come to Penn and they suddenly find that they are playing a big-time schedule, but under the Ivy League restrictions, which meant limited scholarships, no spring practice, no special privileges for athletes. The football team is supposed to be an activity just like any other college campus activity. And at the same time, they're coming to an Ivy League school and they're not qualified really to be students at an Ivy League university.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Previously, the football players had been given special tutoring and stuff like that. But under the Ivy League rules, you couldn't have any special privileges for athletes. So this is this is the gears that these guys were caught in, and that's basically the story that is told in this book.
Tell me about your background. I mean, are you a writer by trade, or what's your background as you personally?
I like to think of myself as above all a journalist.
Okay.
I have written 13 books now.
Wow.
And I've edited 7 publications. I was very involved in the what you would call the alternative media movement. I edited seven different innovative publications. My last book before this was my memoir, in which I talked about all of my efforts on behalf of free speech, which I'm a big believer in.
Sure.
I started out as a sports writer in a little town in Indiana, wound up as the editor of that paper. And then I went to the Wall Street Journal in Chicago, became a freelance writer after that in Chicago, and I became a movie critic and a media critic and a theater critic and a dining critic. I mean, it was just amazing. Then I came to Philadelphia in 1972 as executive editor of Philadelphia Magazine. Subsequently, did some more freelance writing after that, and then got involved with an alternative weekly in Philadelphia called The Welcome Mat.
Yeah.
Which really was a precursor of the internet, because it was a place where anybody could say what's on their mind. People who had something to say and no place else to say it. It was sort of like a gathering place of people in my living room just to exchange ideas. So I've been very involved in, I would say, innovating in the media and trying to teach people that, hey, you don't have to be stuck with the local monopoly newspaper. You can start your own, which was really something nutty to say back in the 70s, let's say, or the 60s.
Yeah.
But nowadays, of course, we're in the internet, and everybody pretends that they're, or likes to think that they're a journalist. Anybody go on online. One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons, in fact, you see a dog sitting in front of a computer, and the dog is saying to himself, well, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. So I would say I've sort of come full circle now. Back in the old days, I was saying you can start your own publication. Now I'm thinking what we really need are mainstream, authoritative publications that can afford to do good journalism and that can pay reporters a decent salary to find out what's really going on. So part of the lesson, I guess, of my career is be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
You may get it.
I'll ask you a question that, with your journalism background, this is a topic that I often encounter here on the podcast.
Yeah.
We hear so much about how journalism has eroded. All the networks now have a slant. Everybody's in their own little bubble. They don't want to hear news that they don't agree with or don't like. That's fake news. They want to watch news that reinforces what they already believe. So, as a journalist and with somebody that has your extensive background and has watched this evolve over the years, do you think there's an audience for real journalism? Would somebody like Walter Cronkite with dark rim glasses and a pocket protector just reading a bunch of facts, would that have an audience today?
Well, everybody now looks back and says, gee, well, good old Walter Cronkite, where is somebody like that? But back in those days, people said, gee, we're stuck with this guy. We don't have any other alternatives. There are only 3 networks back in the 50s or whatever.
Yeah.
So, you look back and in retrospect, everything looks wonderful. I happen to feel, the internet, everybody says it's so terrible. But when you think about it, the criticisms of the internet now are exactly the same criticisms that were made of Johannes Gutenberg 500 years ago when he invented movable type. There were basically 2 criticisms. One was it's going to stir up the lower classes and disrupt the social order, and the other was it's going to lead to an outpouring of pornography. And that's exactly what people say now about the internet. And I guess the point I would make is somehow or other, human beings manage to figure out how to deal with movable type. And I don't think anybody thinks we're worse off because you can now read books or whatever.
Yeah.
And by the same token, I think we're going to figure out how to get reliable information on the internet and how to make it pay for itself. Also, that's one of the big challenges. How can people make money with good journalism on the internet, because
Yeah.
newspapers are gradually eroding, and there are better ways of transmitting information, and you're saving trees with on the internet. But we're going to figure it out. To me, the answer for most people, if you really want to know what's going on, is develop a healthy sense of skepticism. Look at the internet, the sources on the internet, the way you look at your friends. There are some you trust more than others, but there's nobody you really trust entirely. And I think that's part of the problem. People are easily manipulated. You were saying, Billy, about how everybody just wants to hear what the media that tell them what they want to hear. Of course, I've been a media critic all my life, but I always ask people, they're always complaining about the mainstream media or this or that. And I say, have you personally ever been misled by the media? Oh, no, I haven't been misled, but everyone else is being misled by the media. So,
Well, I got to tell you, boy, this is some fascinating stuff. I could go down a real long rabbit hole with you on this, but it's a fascinating perspective, and I'm glad we talked about it, because this gives gives the audience a real good idea of what you're all about and your approach to things. I just absolutely love this. That is fantastic. This is somewhat of a topic that, in regard to what these players went through in the early 1950s. It's not necessarily on everybody's radar. Now, you have a history with it. Is that kind of what brought you to it, or did somebody alert you to this situation?
well, I would say these players, they played for legendary coach George Munger, who coached Penn from 1938 to 53. And every year they would have a brunch, a reunion brunch, and there were hundreds of them would come.
Hmm.
Now I think there are maybe half a dozen who are still alive.
Yeah.
I used to go to these brunches and I'd hear all these stories they would tell. And as I said, several of them said to me, there's a story here nobody's told, and you ought to tell it. And I'm sorry I didn't tell it sooner. And by the way, I'm really one of the maybe the ultimate poster boy for the Ivy League philosophy, because I was one of the worst players on my high school football team. I was a very good kicker, but in all other respects, I was really pathetic. But because I went to an Ivy League school, I was able to try out for the team. And lo and behold, I made it. And all the bigger, tougher, faster guys on the high school team, they didn't get to play football in college. I was the only one. So that's sort of my bias, I guess, here. I think Penn did the right thing. The whole idea of Penn joining the Ivy League was it was going to be as prestigious academically as it had been athletically. And I think that's what happened. Suppose you're a professor or a faculty member, and you have to choose between do you want to teach at an Ivy League school, or do you want to teach at a Big Ten school? I think most of the really good ones would say I'd rather teach at an Ivy League school. More prestige. And that's what attracted to Penn a better faculty and a higher class, I guess, of students also.
Yeah. This kind of calls into the question, the debate. And like I said, I personally believe this. You don't have to be a college football fan. Obviously, if you know the history and all the legendary stories about college football, you're going to enjoy this book that much more. But I don't believe it's a prerequisite. Well, would you say that's true? You don't necessarily have to know a lot about football, because it encompasses so much other about college and everything else.
I think that's right. And one of the great things about, as I say, the players call themselves the Munger men because they played for Coach George Munger. And over the last 5 years, I interviewed 8 of those guys. Only 2 of them are still living now. The others died within the last couple of years. But to read their stories in this book and realize where they came from and what it was like to be playing on on a football team that was really absolutely famous in its day, back in the 40s, is to me really a revelation.
Yeah. These are personal stories. I mean, these are human stories. These are stories about life. So very much, yeah, I really appreciate that aspect of the book. Where I was going though is it does kind of tie in, academics versus athletics. And that's a debate that's been going on for a long time. A lot of people say, the football programs have become way too important in college across the board.
Yeah.
Now, I'm from the land of football. The Professional Football Hall of Fame
Oh,
is
that's right.
quite literally 5 minutes outside my door. I'm
Amazing.
not kidding, and it's an amazing campus. A couple hours, not even quite 2 hours, Ohio State from my house up the road, the Cleveland Browns. This is an area that lives and breathes football. My hometown is Paul Brown, all
Yeah.
those people. So I'm very well aware with what I would call hero worship in regard to athletics, and I know that it can get out of hand.
Well,
There is an argument though that without athletics, without football, a lot of these college programs would not exist. How do you reconcile that?
well, that's a very good question, and I would say ask yourself what is the purpose of a university, and if there's some educational purpose in having sports programs, which I think there is, then you make it available to the students. If it's just for the benefit of raising money or pleasing the alumni or whatever, then there's really no justification for it. And that's where the Ivy League is different from, I would say, from other universities. Now,
Hmm.
the ironic thing is that George Munger, the coach, just in the years before, when was before the Ivy League, was producing these powerhouse football teams, and everybody said, well, if the teams are so powerful, they must be cheating somehow, or they must be admitting inferior students or something like that. And that wasn't so. He was really running an exemplary program,
Hmm.
treated his players like adults. He respected them. And especially after the end of World War II, when he had all these returning veterans coming onto the campus, this was the kind of coach that these guys wanted to play with. Most notably, someone like Chuck Bednarik, who was one of the great football players of all time. They wanted to play for a man like George Munger,
Hmm.
as opposed to someone who just treats them like a drill sergeant or something like that. So he was really epitomized the Ivy League ideal before the Ivy League came into
Yeah.
being.
Yeah.
But
We
the problem was that in 1953 the Ivy League agreement was signed. At that point, Penn still had 3 years left on its big time football schedule. So they're playing teams like Notre Dame and Army and Navy and Ohio State under the Ivy League rules.
Oh, wow.
They couldn't have spring practice or anything. So Munger quit in protest at that point.
Interesting. You talked about how you went and found a lot of these Munger individuals, as they're nicknamed, Mungermen.
Man.
Mungerman, yes. I now you kind of tipped your head a little bit. You went to these meetings that they had, so you met a lot of them there.
Oh,
My
yeah.
question, my question was going to be, how did you track them all down, and how did they react when you said you were writing a book about this? Was like, what do you want to tell that story for? Or were they real happy? What was their reaction?
Oh, I think they were very receptive. I think, they felt that they were forgotten. And once Penn switched from big time football to the Ivy League, a lot of them felt that they were trashed, that Penn didn't want to think about those years. So they were very grateful, I think, for the opportunity. The interesting thing about these Mungermen gatherings, it sort of reminded me of the Grand Army of the Republic after the Civil War, the Union soldiers who would have reunions every year.
Yeah.
I mean, there were thousands of them, And the Munger men also, they would have a brunch. There'd be, a couple of hundred people there. And politicians used to come, and all kinds of people used to come to talk to them. And then gradually, I remember the guy in charge of it said to me one year, "This is a last man's club." And because it started dwindling and dying off. And next thing you know, there were maybe 20 guys, and then there were 10. And now today, I think there are maybe 6.
Wow.
And as I say, only 2 of the ones I interviewed are still alive.
Yeah.
Same thing happened with the Civil War veterans, as you know.
Sure. Yeah, we've gone through that with so many generations of folks, and I know sooner or later everybody's time comes, but it's always sad. My dad, for example, World War II veteran. They're pretty much gone now, except for a few here and there. The ones that really managed to live to 95 or 100 or whatever.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm so glad that you gave them the opportunity to have this story be told, because I do find it very interesting. Now, you had mentioned that in the time that they were in, when they were in this awkward stage of transition, they might not have been so happy. But it seems like from what in the research I've done into your book here, that in hindsight they believe it was the right decision. Is that correct? Were they all pretty much on the same page with that?
Yeah, I think that's right. All of them say, think about how shocking it is. You're playing in front of a crowd of 70,000 people every week, and the streets are mobbed, and you're a celebrity in Philadelphia. And all of a sudden now, today, if Penn gets 10,000 people for a game, they have a party. They think this is wonderful. So a lot of these guys said, how on earth could Penn have given this up? But on the other hand, they say, in retrospect, it really was the right thing to do. In the 40s, there were years when Penn's football team was ranked among the top 10 in the United States. But academically, I don't think Penn was ever higher than 6th among the 8 Ivy League schools in those days.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, you look at the ratings in the Wall Street Journal and other publications. Penn, in one of them, was actually rated 4th in the nation, not just the Ivy League, but it's so. I think these guys are all, they're saying, well, we were very lucky to have lived through that period. But the university is better off now.
Interesting.
I mean, there are some of them who say, well, look at a school like Stanford. It's very well regarded academically, but it also has a great football team.
Yeah.
Maybe that's possible. I don't know.
Well, it's a very selfless attitude to say that, and maybe things did work out for the best. A lot of people can look into this for themselves and kind of decide. But I kind of feel that it's very selfless of them to have, maybe their football dreams weren't realized in the way they thought they would be, but in the long run, it turned out really good. What do you hope the reader takes away from the book?
Well, I guess one of the things I would say is you're looking at the dance that goes on year after year, seemingly, between academics and athletics. And, is the Ivy League ideal is that athletics should be subordinated to academics, and that academic people should be in charge of the athletic programs. On the other hand, you need a lot of money to provide the facilities, to renovate facilities, create whatever it is that you need. And that requires raising a lot of money year after year, mostly from alumni, most of whom have no academic credentials at all. And it's very hard to ask people for money and say, oh, no, you can't have any voice in the program. So that's the real conundrum here, I think.
Yeah. One of the things I'll ask you about is a little anecdote from the book, and this has to do with coaches. And I don't know why, but in football lore in general, the little anecdotes about the coaches are always very good. We've heard them about Vince Lombardi in the pros. Me being from Ohio State, the Woody Hayes story.
Right.
He wouldn't buy gas in Michigan; he had to push the car. So one of the ones that kind of stood out is the way the coach Munger handled the student who felt he couldn't play because of Yom Kippur. Do you
Oh,
want to
yes.
tell? You briefly want to tell that story?
Yeah, well, this is a good example of George Munger was a guy who thought outside the box, I would say. This is the early 40s. He had a starting, one of his starting linemen was a Jewish tackle from New York named Irving Mendelson. And one week, Mendelson told the coach, said, I'm not going to be able to play this Saturday because it's Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day of the year for Jews. Now, most coaches would say, okay, or else they'd say you're off the team. But Munger had a much more creative approach. He picked up the phone, called a Jewish friend in New York, said, find me a rabbi who will tell Irving that it's okay to play on Yom Kippur. And he did.
That's fantastic. That really is good. And that's, that's the type of thing that's in this book. You don't necessarily have to know a lot about football. You don't have to know what a halfback is. You don't have to know all that.
Yeah.
It's just it's a good story. It's a good collection of people's experiences during that time. It's absolutely fantastic. Where can people find out more about you, Dan?
Well, my personal website, danrottenberg.com, or you can look up the book. The name is The Price We Paid. Just look it up online, and you'll find it on Amazon. I think you'll find it in Barnes and Noble also. But my personal website, and I also have a weekly column now that I write on Substack called The Contrarian's Notebook. I think that pretty much says it all. I'd like to think of myself as a contrarian. If you are a liberal, I'll take the conservative position. If you are, or vice versa. The one thing that really gets me nervous is people who think they know the truth.
Oh, yes.
Or the whole truth. I want to listen to people. I don't want to lecture them.
Yes. One thing I've noticed, a lot, we cover a lot of subjects here on the podcast, and especially when people talking about politics or this, that, or the other thing, and they get this real sanctimonious, and that's really hard to listen to. And that's so refreshing. I really, really like the attitude and what you bring to these perspectives. I'm really charged up about that. As he mentioned, the name of the book, The Price We Paid, An Oral History of Penn's Struggle to Join the Ivy League, 1950 to 1955. Publisher Shorehouse Books, 2024. And here again, we are here today. I'm here today on behalf of HOPress Shorehouse Books. Great place, humoroutcast.com. That's kind of like a thing that they have under their umbrella to showcase writers and other things going on. The place to take a humor break. Funny stuff there, humoroutcast.com. And once again, be sure you check out Dan Rottenberg. He is the author, The Price We Paid. Very interesting story. And here again, athletics is a great way to tell a story about life. I mean, I think we all have win one for the Gipper. I mean, athletics and stories about life go together like peanut butter and chocolate. And this is a great time period to analyze if you enjoy the evolution of sports and athletics, especially on the collegiate level. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the program. We really appreciate you.
My pleasure, Billy, and thank you.
Well, thank you for listening out there. We really appreciate your ears. My name is Billy Dees. You can find me on Twitter, which is now called X. Real easy to find on Twitter at Billy Dees. That's kind of like my social media home. You can find the Billy Dees podcast anywhere you find podcasts. We are on all the major platforms, and we're getting close now to a 10-year history online. So we're real easy to find. Thank you very much for listening, and we will talk to you again really soon.